businesses have to make all of their money in 6 months. There was more cultural understanding I had to get when working with Americans than I've had so far working with New Zealanders. Most Canadians, I would say, in my business dealings there are true to their word, but you want the paperwork.
Najib, who's joining us with his expertise from Canada.
That's right.
And yeah.
Expertise.
Yes. Lots of expertise. But also in trade as well. And so I think it would be great if you would start in terms of just introducing yourself, where you're from, what you've done, and we'll go from there.
Well, yeah, thanks for having this chat with me, Danny, and I appreciate that. I've been in New Zealand a total of 7 months now. Yeah, 7.5 months. So all of my, New Zealand experience, I'll throw in there as well. I just learned about horses for courses.
It's a good saying.
It is a good saying. I'm going to use it. Let's see. So I'm a marketing and management consultant. I've been doing that for a couple of decades now. Canada, I lived in Canada for over 30 years. I was born overseas. I've also lived and worked in Asia and the Middle East as well. I've worked in packaged goods as a brand manager. I worked for a Japanese company, a British company, and a US company. So a little bit of that experience as well. In management and marketing, economic development was sort of my niche, my expertise, especially with indigenous communities, municipalities. I did some commodities work with like rice and cotton and granite and marble and that kind of stuff, exporting it from Asia into Africa when I lived out there. So that's sort of been my forte, the branding, marketing stuff, and a little bit of the management consulting. I've also somehow, in the midst of all of that, became a political strategist, so I'm an advisor to elected officials and political parties, and an analyst I was an analyst on some of the networks in Canada, covering elections and that kind of stuff. So a little bit understanding of the political world as well.
What I thought in terms of where we'd start today is, and I've talked about this in a couple of other interviews, is there does seem to be a bit of a well-trodden path for a lot of New Zealand companies where they go, Australia and then US, and US is almost seen as like an ultimate goal in a lot of ways for them as well. And although US is 50 states and everything else which goes along with that, do you think that they should actually be looking at Canada, or Canada is an option that they should be considering when they look at North America?
Oh, definitely. I mean, it's strange to me, when my wife and I started looking at New Zealand as a place to come to, like how little my business circles and personal circles knew about New Zealand at all. I mean, Australia is always like the big place where people want to travel to. Australia's done a great job of marketing itself in North America, but New Zealand, is not even on anyone's radar. I mean, many people we told we were moving to New Zealand had to look to see where New Zealand was, right? Like,
we do get left off a few maps and things.
But I say to people all the time, Canada had this kind of inferiority complex with the U.S. for the longest time, right? Because we share this massive border with them. We're so reliant on them. Our politics and economies are intertwined because of oil and gas and many other things. But slowly we're separating away from that and looking at other markets and growing with other markets and developing relationships with other markets. So, when I was in packaged goods, we used to use Australia as more of our benchmark than Canada, because Canada, it's like 10 times population size, 10 times the size. They're a $30 trillion, GDP versus our $2 trillion GDP in Canada. Right, so but Australia was much more comparable, similar, another huge country with a small population, just similar to Canada, right? But I think New Zealand has a unique opportunity because the longer that I'm here, the cultures are so similar, right? Much more similar than even Australia. And, I tell my friends in Canada, if I dropped them here, blindfolded them, dropped them into a mall in Auckland, it would take them a while to realize they weren't in Canada. People dress the same. Mannerisms, the multiculturalism, the stores, everything is very similar, and the interactions are very similar, and the business events and things I've been to, like the cultures are very similar. To me, it seems like it'd be much easier to go over that hump, which is always, as you know, with international trade, a hump to understand culture differences and things like that between New Zealand and Canada than New Zealand and the US.
Yeah. Interesting. So I suppose the other part of that as well is that there's been, a lot of press, a lot of coverage, when it comes to some of the trade agreements which have happened. So obviously EU had quite a bit of coverage around it, around what was happening there and the opportunities that just simply weren't there before. Now UAE has joined the mix in terms of free trade agreements as well. Do you think that there's things as well that Kiwi exporters just wouldn't be aware of, potentially some trade benefits that there may be in terms of trading with Canada?
I don't know what it is. This. Let me hope I get this acronym right. CPTPP.
Yes.
Could they have made that more difficult?
Yeah.
So the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Canada is part of it, from what I understand. They're the second largest partner in it, right? So they're part of it. There's already existing bilateral trade between Canada and New Zealand, and it's pretty even exports and imports. It's about a 1.5 billion, exports, 1.5 billion imports. So, so that's pretty good. So there's something to build on, right? So, Canada or New Zealand's shipping lamb and wine and butter, to Canada and travel obviously between both countries. There's some of that stuff going on, and from what I understood, I'm no expert on the CPTPP, but to me, it virtually eliminates tariffs between New Zealand and Canada. Like 99% of tariffs are going to go away, which to me that seems like it'd be quite attractive. There's business visas that you can get in Canada, if you want to travel to Canada, do business there. I think it's like between 3 to 6 months, depending on your needs. You can go and stay there and conduct business. There's really opportunities for Canadians to work for New Zealand firms or New Zealanders to work in Canada, and get visas for that. So all of that kind of stuff is in place, right? So, it seems pretty seamless. Now, I haven't done it yet, other than I'm a remote worker myself here in New Zealand for a Canadian firm. So, I guess I'll learn the ins and outs of it. But it seems like it's pretty efficient in terms of getting the trade going. There's a basis for it, and there's ways to accommodate for it.
Like as you mentioned before as well, there's that similarity in terms of the cultures between New Zealand and Canada. But do you think that there are sort of cultural or consumer considerations that Kiwi businesses need to think about before they enter the market? I suppose there's the obvious one of French, in terms of, I'm sure that would be, was it mandatory on the labeling as well?
It is mandatory on the labeling. It's not as big as an impact for folks outside of Quebec as it's made out to believe. Yes, it's one of our national languages. But it is in decline, in terms of a national language. English is the language of business across Canada. So outside of Quebec, it's not really that important to know French. You can get by without it. In Quebec, obviously they have the same kind of nationalism. They want French speaking, etc. Is that totally understandable? Quebec is the second largest province by population. But there's other provinces which have great economies, and the further west you go in Canada, away from Quebec, the less French becomes an issue. Other cultural things, like I said, kissing cousins, definitely Canada and New Zealand in many ways.
That's a great phrase.
Much more so. Again, I'll say this over and over again. Much more so than I think there was more cultural understanding I had to get when working with Americans than I've had so far working with New Zealanders. Even like the casual atmosphere, approach, the politeness, the niceness, like it's much more similar between Canada and New Zealand. Toronto, which is Canada's biggest city, has a little bit of corporate culture in boardrooms. Like, I remember once I was going to a boardroom meeting there, and I was wearing, I can't remember what color shirt, a blue dress shirt, and my boss said, no, you can only wear white dress shirts to this kind of a formal board meeting. But the further you go west again, or east, like more casual, much more casual, very similar to New Zealand. The biggest difference, I think, there's a couple of things I think that New Zealanders need to be aware of. One is seasonality in Canada has a way different meaning. Like literally people change not just how they wear, what they wear between winter and summer, but how they eat. Like winter affects everything, right? I mean, because you get into places like the prairies where it's cold for 6 months of the year. It totally changes consumer behavior, right? So you have to be very aware that I know people here make a big deal about the seasons, but Canada it's another level in understanding how that impacts how people behave and purchase and make their decisions.
So what you might be selling for half of the year might not sell at all.
Many businesses have to make all of their money in 6 months, whether it's a summer-based business or a winter-based business, right? They have to make all their money in that time period. And then if you have any fluctuation in weather, early summer, late summer, early winter, late winter, right? It messes everything up. So that part of it, I think, is really important. The other piece I would say is, and I haven't had, a lot of, so I'm not sure this is a huge difference, but if New Zealand is more of a, we shake hands and we have an agreement kind of place, Canada is not. I mean, most Canadians, I would say in my business dealings there, are true to their word, but you want the paperwork. You want to do the due diligence. Is it same?
Similar, yeah.
Then so, beautiful.
Yeah.
Like the handshake goes a long ways, but do your due diligence. Make sure you have the legal stuff sorted out. Make sure you have the paperwork.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, cool. And so, sorry, just going back to things like the labeling though, is that a requirement like across the country in terms of having the dual language?
Now, when I was in packaged goods, it was. I don't know if that's relaxed.
Okay.
But from what I see from most packaging, it isn't.
Okay.
It is still a requirement to have both languages.
Yeah. And as you mentioned before around, lamb and wine sort of, and I suppose dairy, taking advantage of, the CPTPP and other things as well, in terms of being able to go over to the Canadian market. Do you think that these, in your 7.5 months in New Zealand, do you think that there's other niches within New Zealand that would be sort of well suited for the Canadian market?
This is a weird thing, right? Because I've worked in, almost every sector as a management consultant, and New Zealand products are not anywhere on most people's radar. I would say wine probably is on, if you're a wine aficionado, you probably have, good opinions about New Zealand wine.
Yeah.
Definitely lamb, like everybody knows New Zealand lamb, best in the world, right? Like, but like, when I was leaving, someone told me, you got to check out Rod and Gun, check out this clothing store. You never heard of it, right?
Yeah.
I see it here and it's everywhere, right? And apparently it's supposed to be a great brand.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think one of the things that probably both the government and the industry could do is really raise profile of those kinds of things. Things that already have maybe in other markets prestige and established brands.
Yes.
That needs to be done. That work needs to be done in Canada.
Yeah.
You really, and it's not like Australian products are that highly thought of either, right?
Yeah.
I think like just this whole area, of the southeast, the Pacific, is kind of like overlooked in lots of parts of North America.
Yeah.
Everything's like Europe, centric.
Yeah.
Really is.
And so, when you mention some of those things in terms of like the wine and lamb and things like that, and obviously, here in New Zealand, we sort of hear that and we think, well, that's good, and so we must be number one there or whatever it is. But how are we actually perceived? When it comes to sort of in comparison to, you mentioned Europe, I suppose wine from Europe and lamb and meat from other areas as well. How do we sort of fare, in comparison to those other products as well?
Well, I mean, it's a good news, bad news kind of scenario. Like honestly, like I said, there's very low perception of Kiwi and New Zealand brands in Canada, which means there's a lot of upside there, right?
Yeah.
And the brands that people are aware of, like I said, the lamb and the wine. But you remember, BC has wines in Canada, Ontario has wines that are also highly thought of. And Canadians too, like New Zealanders, want to shop and buy local as much as they can as well. And there's more and more push towards that, right?
Yeah.
So something has to be very unique and different, to really compete with that kind of stuff. Right?
Yeah. Are you saying premium or just unique, really?
Both. It has to be different, right? Like, everybody wants something that they can't necessarily get, or even like a prestige around a brand, right? Like like Paris wine, or that kind of, or champagne, or all this kind of stuff, right? People want that, and I think there's so much opportunity. The negatives that I hear people here talk about New Zealand, to me, like, are such big opportunities. Like, it's so isolated. That's an opportunity. To be isolated as a travel destination is a huge opportunity for adventure travelers. Like my wife and I used to be before we had kids. And that's how my wife came to New Zealand when she was young, right? It's because her travel agent told her, hey, if you're going to Australia, you might as well go to New Zealand. And she ended up spending, like, I can't remember, 6 months or something here. She loved it so much, right?
Yeah.
I think that aspect, Iceland is a perfect example.
Yeah.
How Iceland has marketed itself as a travel destination, as a, you don't want Iceland to be your end destination, but hey, we're just a hop, skip, jump, and then you're into the UK, and then you're into Europe. Why don't you catch us on your way there, or catch us on the way back? I think that's such a massive opportunity. Like, why isn't New Zealand on my way when all these people are flocking to Indonesia, Thailand, Australia? Why isn't New Zealand just a part of that itinerary? Like, you might as well. You're in the area. You might as well check out one of the most beautiful islands in the world. Right? Like, and I think that kind of approach really has to be taken in terms of I think tourism is a massive opportunity. Like, I can't believe that tourism from Canada to New Zealand is as small as it is. To me, it's a massive opportunity, and whoever's working on that needs to really take an Icelandic approach to it. Iceland is, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but Iceland is like now on everybody's radar who's going to Europe, right? Like, hey, let's go to Iceland first. They've done a phenomenal job, and I think New Zealand could do a similar sort of strategy. And then and the same thing, and then you do the quid pro quo, like every time I talk to a New Zealander who's a traveler, they talk about traveling to Canada, right? Like, they haven't been, they really want to go, so we need to make that easier and really emphasize it and really incentivize it, right? With flights or however we do it, packages, things, right? That bilateral travel. The other opportunity, I think, and every country says this, but I really think it's, the more I spend time in New Zealand, I really think the opportunities in tech between Canada and New Zealand are huge. Like, first of all, Canada is an emerging tech haven, all over the country, especially in Ontario and Toronto, where a lot of tech has come up with, and thanks to BlackBerry and establishing like a tech corridor in Toronto, but Alberta and other provinces are also making heavy moves. But it's not just like the tech in the way people think of it, like e-commerce or that kind of stuff, but also agritech, health tech, manufacturing tech, like almost everything you can think of. There's a massive opportunity, I think, in Canada for New Zealanders who have expertise in this area, because agritech especially, I think Canadians would be very open to any type of agritech solutions that New Zealanders can offer. Health tech, so much health is now going online, right? So much, and I think that in many ways New Zealand has a step up in terms, and as most isolated countries do, right? Because they're doing heavily investment in tech because they have to, right? And I think there's so many opportunities to take that kind of approach to the tech sector in Canada. Everybody there is working on applications and e-commerce and things like that, but like to take a very sector-based approach, like we're going to export our agritech knowledge from New Zealand to Canada, right? I think would be very, very, very well welcomed.
Okay. As you mentioned before, with CPTPP, and a lot of those tariffs and things have disappeared, but are there regulations and things that New Zealanders need to be aware of or need to consider, when they are venturing into Canada?
It's not my area of expertise, so I can't really say. I would say it's sector specific. I would say, there's different things that you have to make sure that you're on top of. Always when dealing with government, you're better off to be cautious and also double your timeline. If you think something's going to happen in 6 months, it's probably going to happen in a year or more.
Yeah.
As we're well aware with governments all over the world, but and always, that first shipment, that first sale takes a lot longer.
Yeah.
And to build that into your timelines and into your costs. But other than that, I mean, from what the little that I know, again, like it's not my area of expertise. I think it's a pretty smooth and open transaction. Thanks to things like CPTPP.
I know it's a little bit of a mouthful, but that's the main thing that I've seen sort of going into the trade side of things is just got to watch the acronyms. But,
I know.
Yeah,
it's funny because in the acronym isn't comprehensive part of the acronym, but the acronym is anything but.
Yes. In terms of Canada as well, do you think that there's any emerging trends that Kiwis could look out for or capitalize on as well? Like you mentioned, obviously the tech sector and what's happening there. Are there other sectors as well where there's potentially some emerging trends?
Like I said, agritech and any specialized sort of tech for specializing in the industries that Canada is known for, like manufacturing, construction, agriculture, I think is a huge opportunity, and hands down travel. Now that I've been here, I don't, and talking with people who are travelers back home, and they have zero idea of New Zealand. Literally, people think of it as just a small island, but I'm trying to explain to people, like, this isn't a place where you just go for 10 days and you see the country. You know what I mean? You could spend 10 days in just Auckland, right?
Yeah.
So I think that, other than the Lord of the Rings, which is an amazing job.
It still attracts people.
It's an amazing job of raising the profile of New Zealand. Every time I send pictures back home, people are just like, that's also New Zealand? That's also New Zealand? Because, the people don't understand how different all the different terrain and beaches and mountains, and, they don't understand how, it's not, all just beaches or all just what you see in Lord of the Rings, right? It's, it's amazing. Both the South Island and the North Island, and I think it's just there has to be a strategy again for travel between the two countries that just makes it almost something you must do. You have to do it, right? And it just isn't like in Australia for the longest time was like a travel destination for Canadians, like you have to go to Australia, right? And Australians are also very visible in Canada if you're traveling like in the touristy spots, like they're everywhere. So that also helps raise the profile of it, right? But I think that something similar for Canada, or sorry, for New Zealand.
Maybe Kiwis are just to the side of being polite and not.
No, they're
not being visible.
there is part of that, right? Like Canada suffered for that for a long time. Like we didn't want to put attention on ourselves.
Yes.
We left that to the Americans, to be the. But there's a quiet way, I think, of bringing attention to yourself, and a quiet way of talking about your country. I said this to someone the other day, and they were just like, and it seemed to me, it seemed like it didn't occur to them before, to a Kiwi, and I said, Auckland is a top 10 city. Like in North America, Auckland would be a top 10 city. 1.7 million people, world-class city with the ports and beaches and right, like this. If you took Auckland and put it in North America, it would be hands down a top 10 city, not just for population size, but everything else. Like, yes, New Zealand is small, 5 million people, etc. But Auckland itself, just the opportunity to market Auckland as a world-class city is, like, it's not a stretch. If you can market, LA and New York and, even some of the smaller cities in America, you can definitely market Auckland that way as well, right? And then again, too, and I encourage everyone who's thinking of international trade, and I do this myself, and I think many retailers have learned this the hard way as well, is don't think of the whole country as your target. Find a part of the country. Like Canada is so vast. It's literally every province is like its own country. Right?
And isn't Toronto like
6 million people, 7 million people, right? Like,
Yeah.
It's massive. It's the fourth biggest city in North America, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, take a province like Alberta, which I've spent a lot of time in Alberta. It has two major cities, Calgary and Edmonton, each are 1.3, 1.4 million, similar size to Auckland, right? It has per capita it has, if you take out oil and gas, Alberta and New Zealand have similar GDP. Similar population, 5 million people in Alberta as well.
Yeah.
Alberta's 3 times the size of New Zealand, but everything is bigger in Canada, right? We have lots of land. But just look at that, right? And look in the terms of like, okay, you got 2 major cities, you've got a population that's similar to New Zealand, you've got an economy that's similar to New Zealand, and just focus on a lot of retailers, especially from America, that come into Canada, always go into Alberta first because high disposable income, highly educated population, and very competitive retail. And at first you would think, well, why would I want to go in a competitive retail environment? Well, because if you can do it there, you can do it anywhere, as the saying goes, right? So the idea is like, hey, let's set ourselves up in these smaller markets first, make sure that we can access this highly educated, with high disposable incomes population, and then we'll go into the bigger markets of Vancouver and Toronto, right? So you take a similar approach, right? Let's take what we're doing here, doing well in New Zealand or in Auckland, and see if we can make it work in a city like Edmonton or Calgary or a province like Alberta, because they're economically and culturally very similar.
Absolutely. So, rounding up, what would be your final advice for people who are thinking of that Canadian market, or where they could go in terms of the Canadian market as well?
I think people would be very surprised. I think if businesses here have not thought about the Canadian market, haven't made a visit over there, haven't tried to make networks or connections, which I'm happy to do for anyone that needs to the best of my ability. I have decent networks in over the country. So, but I think you'll be surprised. Like I think it'll be much less painful in terms of the cultural aspects and things like that. I think it's much more manageable. The cost of entry, my guess, is a lot lower in Canada than it is in the US. Definitely a lot less. You'd be a bigger fish in a bigger pond, versus the US. And I think too is that overall it'd be a much more pleasant experience because the cultures are so similar, and the lifestyles are so similar. The outdoor lifestyle is very important to Canadians as well. Just maybe the first time you go, don't go in winter.
We try to the wrong impression.
We try to encourage people to come in the summer because it makes the winter more bearable. But or I mean, you got the reverse way. You come into winter and then you can only get better after that. But I mean, if you love winter sports, Canada's the place. Like if you love skiing and out cross country skiing and all the other wonderful stuff that you can do in the winter, Canada's the place for sure.
Awesome. Excellent. Oh, well, thanks for your time today, and thanks for coming in.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.